Hello everyone, welcome to the One Take Show. My name is Kaustubh Srivastav and today we are in conversation with a very special guest. Our guest today is Mr. Abhishek Dwivedi. Sir is a practicing advocate in Lucknow as well as in Mumbai, and today Sir has taken time off his very busy schedule to talk about two very relevant topics. Firstly, we will talk about force majeure and how is it different from frustration in a contract, and secondly we will talk about economic nationalism and what does that mean in the world of international arbitration. If you like this episode, make sure you like, share and subscribe. You can also tune into the podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts and multiple other such platforms. If you have any suggestions, feedbacks, make sure you reach out to me. I would absolutely love that. Hence, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's jump right into the discussion. Hello, sir. Welcome to the One Take Show. I am so excited to have you on my podcast. To all my listeners out there who is watching this video and who are listening to this podcast, I've had an opportunity to work under Sir's guidance in the past, and trust me, Sir is my mentor and he has taught me a lot of stuff and has always been a guiding factor. Thank you so much, sir, for taking time off your very busy schedule and gracing my podcast today.
Yeah, very busy schedule, Kaustubh. Thank you for having me here. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. So today we are going to talk about a very interesting topic in context of how this change that we are observing around us, the pandemic is trying to give us new perspectives to the legal understanding that we have around us. One of those very important concepts that we have is force majeure. What usually happens amongst at least law students is that we confuse force majeure with concepts like frustration or the impossibility to perform a contract. So today I would love to know, firstly, as a part of the first substantial discussion of our conversation, that the scope and the meaning of force majeure clause in a commercial contracts, and how is it different from doctrine of frustration. So I would love to know your opinion on the same.
See, the first thing what anyone has to understand when reading this concept is that force majeure is solely a creation of contract. Unless you have a force majeure clause in your contract, you will not be able to get any benefit out of it. Now, what exactly is a force majeure event? A force majeure event is any event which makes the performance of the contract temporarily impossible or fundamentally different, radically different, or completely impossible without the fault of the either party. It has nothing to do with fault-based liability. If either of the parties is responsible for the event or the non-performance arising out of it, they cannot invoke the doctrine of force majeure. Sorry, the contractual remedy of force majeure. Now, force majeure can lead to temporary suspension of contract as well as completely ending the contract. It depends on the circumstances. I'll give you an example. For instance, there is a strike planned by a labor group for 1 month in a mining contract which is for 30 years. While it may qualify for the force majeure event, the mining company can write to the government saying that for these 30 days we will not be able to extract any coal, and therefore this event would qualify as a force majeure event because, see, it's not my fault that the strike is happening, it's not government's fault that the strike is happening, but the strike is happening and it's covered under the contract. So therefore this will be a force majeure event, but this will not be a frustrating event. This will only temporarily suspend the operation of the contract. This will not end the contract completely. That is the primary understanding of force majeure clause. Now, see, it's a contractual remedy. It arrived from the Roman law and French law, force majeure itself. But it finds its legitimacy in India under section 32 of ICA, which says that when a certain events become impossible after the contract has been executed. But however, it's a contractual remedy. The parties are free to decide what will constitute a force majeure event, what will not constitute a force majeure event, how to invoke a force majeure clause. For instance, in almost all the contracts right now, when a strike happens, for example, or when the permission for the land acquisition permission is struck down by the court, the party which is performing the contract has to inform the other party within certain period of coming of know of the force majeure event. So the procedural requirements under the contract will also have to be met. So the force majeure itself is a completely contractually dependent remedy. If you don't have a force majeure clause in the contract, you cannot invoke it. If you don't follow the procedure envisaged under the contract in commercial contracts for this force majeure, you cannot invoke it at all. Then moving to frustration. Now, frustration is a completely common law remedy. It doesn't matter whether you have a clause in the contract or not. Frustration will survive. It's a completely law-based remedy. It comes under Section 56 of Indian Contract Act. It's a subset of force majeure, in the sense when force majeure event, I'm not talking about the clause, I'm talking about the force majeure event, the underlying event that renders the performance impossible or difficult or temporarily suspended. When the performance is completely impossible, then the contract cannot be performed no matter what happens. In the manner it was envisaged under the contract, it becomes the doctrine of frustration. So what force majeure does, it allows you to temporarily suspend or end the contract. Frustration only ends the contract. The day frustrating event happens and you notify, all further obligations are discharged. Neither party is under any obligation to perform the agreement whatsoever. It ends. The contract is killed, in simple words. Secondly, and one of the most important things, it does not depend on the conduct of the parties. Now, what happens in force majeure? There is a force majeure event. The contract has become impossible to perform, but you did not notify the other party. So while the force majeure event happened, you will not be able to take benefit because you failed to comply with the procedural requirement. Therefore, the conduct of parties is relevant in terms of the contract. In case of frustration, it does not matter. The moment frustrating event happens, your contract is over. You notify the other side, your contract is over, you're done and dusted. All the obligations that have arisen prior to the frustration will have to be completed, but all the obligations which were to be performed post the frustrating event will not have to be done. I'll give you an example. What exactly would be a frustration and what would be a force majeure event? So let's take example of a 99-year lease. 99-year contract for supply of 50 vehicles every month. Now for this COVID period, for example, the factories were shut down, the exports were shut down, everything was shut down because of government guidelines. So this would amount to a force majeure event for the period of lockdown. Right? It will temporarily suspend the contract. But will it frustrate the contract? Does it mean that for entire 99 years now you cannot supply the vehicles? No. That is the difference. Frustration has to mean that the contract cannot be performed at all in the manner it was supposed to be. Now I'll give you an example of a contract which is frustrated. Is the monologue going too long?
So please, this is very enriching as a conversation, because I have a very significant point that I've taken away from that segment. Firstly, you talk about how force majeure is very contractually dependent, and does not necessarily mean that if it is not included as a contractual clause, one cannot invoke it. Which gives me a question, as in most of the debt-ridden industries, like the airways or some companies like that who have some contractual obligations. These contractual obligations will not benefit them if they do not have a force majeure clause, and will not give them the way out for the force majeure. Is that correct to infer at this stage?
Yes, you are correct. The only point is, in these industries which are highly leveraged and highly institutionalized, force majeure clauses are present, and most of the parties involved in these transactions do not want these companies to fall. So they generally agree to a post force majeure event application of force majeure clause. Also, they add a clause if they haven't. The biggest setback of this the biggest problem you'll face will be the MSME industries, the small industries which generally use the templates given by their associations or given by the Vyapari Sanghs, which have a very boilerplate clause of 2 words saying that this will constitute force majeure and this will not constitute, or they don't even talk about the procedure or what, they have an exhaustive definition. So the biggest problem that will arise in this case when they cannot invoke a force majeure clause will happen in the MSME sector and not in the highly corporatized or institutionalized sectors.
Right.
Now, I'll just, on this point, I'll give you an example of, since you brought the airways, I had noted an example of what exactly would be a frustrating event. For instance, if I enter into a contract with you for delivery of a specific helicopter manufactured by Bell with a specific number, let's say VT101. Now, that helicopter got caught in a cyclone and got destroyed while coming from Dubai. Now that helicopter is gone. It's not available. While I can have a replacement helicopter, I can give you a replacement helicopter, but it will not be the helicopter we contracted for, because it was a specific helicopter with a specific number and a specific make. Therefore, the contract cannot be performed in the manner we agreed, and therefore it is frustrated.
Right, sir.
I'll give you another example. For instance, when you come to cultivation of peppermint, it requires a certain kind of land, and the cultivators generally prefer a land which is near to a river. Now, I contracted with you to get my peppermint supply from a specific field which is next to a specific river because the quality is good. Now, tomorrow a flood comes and the entire field gets destroyed. The contract will be frustrated. You cannot give me an alternate supply from somewhere else. The contract's performance has become impossible. However, if I just contract for instance, say coal from you, that I want to buy 50 tons of coal from you, you had in your mind planned that I will get my coal from Indonesia. And that coal supply suddenly stopped because Indonesian government said, no, we will not supply coal to India due to some international dispute. That will not amount to frustration, because I never asked you to get me coal specifically from Indonesia. Just because the obligation on you, now you have to buy the coal in India, which is much more costly. Just because the financial cost has increased does not mean that the contract is frustrated. It has to be radically and commercially impossible, not merely onerous. Merely financial difficulty will not get you out of the contract. Only financial impossibility will.
Right, sir.
This is
right. Right, sir. This is a very interesting angle to the situation. Clearly defines the two major distinctions that we have between frustration for contract and force majeure, and what all the requirements are with two areas. This brings me to my second question, and in fact, a question that will really give my listeners and to me as well an opportunity to really understand how can someone invoke a force majeure clause. So basically, force majeure clauses need to be invoked in a certain way, and I would love to know your opinion on the same.
See, how a force majeure clause is invoked will directly depend on the wording of the clause. Most of the clauses, if you see infrastructure contracts, most of these clauses require you to notify the authority or notify the other side as soon as you come to know of the force majeure event, and in no later than 7 days. Then you have to provide the evidence of the force majeure event. You have to provide how it is affecting you, and then you have to provide a timeline that by when do you see this being rectified and what do you expect out of us. In most of these contracts, the expectation is of time extension rather than damages, because they want this force majeure period to be excluded from the period they have been given to perform a contract. But when it comes to the principle based invocation of this force majeure clauses, there are four things which you have to keep in your mind. Firstly, you have to clearly identify the force majeure event. And that is very essential. For instance, right now, the pandemic may not be the force majeure event for certain contracts, but the associated lockdown will be. So you have to identify the force majeure event very clearly. Then secondly, you have to establish the causation, that how that force majeure event, how that lockdown, how that force majeure is affecting your business. I'll give an example of this when we come to the COVID situation and how COVID will be interpreted. So causation has to be established, that how this force majeure event is affecting your business. Thirdly, for instance, the pharmaceutical industry right now cannot claim COVID. In the sense, if they have been given all the essential passes, if they have been given everything, they cannot go to their supplier and say that no, I will not supply because of lockdown. When they have given the passes, they have been exempted from everything. Thirdly, you have to show that the performance has become impossible, either for the temporary period or till the end, depending on what remedy you are seeking, whether you are seeking to suspend the contract or terminate the contract. So you have to show what is the effect. You have identified the event, you have established the causation effect of the event on you. Now you have to show that whether it's impossible to perform the contract, either it temporarily or completely. Then lastly, you have to inform them what exactly are you seeking out of the force majeure event. Are you seeking to temporarily suspend the contract? You are seeking to completely terminate the contract? You are seeking a time extension, or you are seeking damages for the delay which is happening? Now, very interesting thing you will notice nowadays in contract is that parties are also ascribing liability for the force majeure events. In the sense, it becomes a risk bargain. That okay, if a force majeure event happens, I will take liability for the damages arising out of it as long as I get the extension. For instance, let's say there is a highway contract for construction of a highway, and suddenly the High Court strikes down the land acquisition. Notice 6(4) is strike down, saying that the land acquisition was improper. Now the government goes to Supreme Court to get a stay. It might take a month, right? Now, this event may or may not qualify as force majeure depending on the clause. If it qualifies as force majeure, while the government will be forced to give you an extension for the period, but all the cost associated with idling of resources, for the labor cost and the overhead cost at the site, who were just sitting without work for a month till the land acquisition issue was sorted out, may still be to the contractor's account if the contract provides so. So this is very interesting recent thing that has developed. It started in 2006 or 7 in England, and now it has been incorporated in almost all the contracts in which at least government is a party.
Right, sir. Right, so this brings me to one of the points that you mentioned, and which was something that stood out for me, was that how a pandemic or a situation can have two different interpretations within the definition of force majeure. You mentioned how a pandemic might not be a force majeure, but lockdown can be a force majeure within the definition. So, understanding this, whether COVID-19 or this pandemic itself would be covered under force majeure in India at least, or will the lockdown be covered under the force majeure? Because we see a lot of developments and government actions with respect to, for example, IBC have been with respect to lockdown, and they've taken actions with respect to lockdown. So what exactly is the distinction, and if there is, so what is your opinion on this?
See, in India, the position is very clear right now that COVID as well as the COVID-19 will be considered as a force majeure event, and all associated or subsidiary reasons arising out of it will be a force majeure event. Now I'll clarify why I use the word event. Because of there is a guidelines on public procurement, a policy manual on public procurement, which has the government has brought out, under which it has defined that pandemic COVID-19 will constitute a force majeure event. Similarly, the Ministry of Renewable Energy has also clarified that in all its solar contracts and public procurement contracts, this will amount to a force majeure event. Now, assuming even if the COVID is a force majeure event, it may not be directly impacting your business. For instance, if you are an industry which is run based on work from home, you are not going to get affected because of the COVID at all. You cannot go to your client and say that no, because of COVID, it has been declared a force majeure event. You have to give me the benefit of this. No, the work from home, you were supposed to deliver something, some virtual, for instance, software or something by working from home, or you could have worked remotely. See, we have to understand at the end of the day, doctrine of force majeure and frustration both are doctrines of good faith. That I tried everything in my power to do and perform the contract, but I was prevented by a factor beyond my control to perform this. Unless you have given your good faith, you can't claim any of these doctrines. So your behavior, your understanding of the event will also matter. You have to establish the causation that yes, the COVID actually affected me. Now let's take example of the bank services, essential services, the bank services. Now the banks were required to be open for all essential services. Now a ATM management agency cannot claim force majeure or cannot claim that COVID did not allow me to work, because you were exempted. You were specifically exempted. The bank gave you passes, the bank gave you letters specifically, you were given passes and you were supposed to do your work. Now you cannot come and say that, okay, I cannot perform this contract for this period because of the lockdown or because of the COVID. This won't apply to you because the government has negated the effect of this pandemic on you. Right? You understand my point, right?
Yes, sir.
So this is the one. Now I'll just differentiate between 2 or 3 things in relation to COVID. Now COVID can be a force majeure event depending on the clauses of the contract. Same with lockdown. Lockdown can be or cannot be a force majeure event depending upon the contract. Now it will be a frustrating event in short-term contracts. It can be. For instance, if I have a contract with you that by July I will supply you some 10,000 vehicles for export, and since till July lockdown is happening and the markets didn't open, for instance, I'm manufacturing something, my factory is located in a red zone or in a containment zone, and I was unable to open my factory and produce those vehicles, I cannot supply to you. This is a frustrating event easily because my performance of the contract in the manner I envisaged is completely gone. There is no way I can supply those vehicles to you by July because I'm not able to produce, I'm not able to manufacture these vehicles. But again, we go back to the same example that if I have a 99 years contract to deliver 50 vehicles every month, in that case, it won't be a frustration. Because the entire contract doesn't get frustrated. I might not supply in July, but for August, September, October, November, I'll keep supplying. So for this duration, you can ask me for damages, or I can claim force majeure, or I can claim that for this period, I could not have delivered. But for the rest, I can. So I cannot say that my entire contract for 99 years is frustrated because I was unable to deliver these vehicles to you temporarily. So this is the entire background. There are few good cases which have come out. I will send you the links. You can put it in your podcast if you want, if people want to read.
Right, so I most certainly will, because this has been a very in-depth analysis and has given me a very clear picture for me, and I believe for all my listeners who are trying to understand the entire situation and are going about it in a way that they understand, they interpret force majeure and frustration in different ways. They understand the differences and how they are to be invoked in different circumstances. So thank you.
This is going to create a lot of issues. I have never issued so many opinions on force majeure and frustration like I have done in last, say, 1 month. It's crazy, from banks to MSMEs to contractors to small agencies which were involved in. For instance, I got 2 opinions who were agencies who were involved who are dealing with smartwatches, which they were importing from China and rebranding and selling them. So a lot of people are seeking opinions. So it's going to be a important doctrine. Hopefully it will get us cases, but let's see what happens.
Well, it's good to know that not just the law students, the entire industry is going to learn from this conversation that we have had. This brings me to my second very significant portion of our substantial discussion for today, where I have this opportunity to learn about a very interesting topic, that is the growth of economic nationalism and how is that impacting international investment arbitration or international investment in a sense. So we talk about economic nationalism and we have various articles, we have various claims and arguments as in how it is happening, what countries are playing what role they have. But how is it impacting the investment arbitration in general? So here is a question, and I read this out, quote unquote, that what are your opinion on rise of populist movement towards economic nationalism, reflecting upon the situations of the frustration of social groups that suffer from the globalization and laissez-faire state trends in the global economy? So in a sense, we understand that this situation will be given me an opportunity to ask you this question, and I would love to learn from your opinion.
See, the one single line answer to this complex question is that free market is dead.
Right, sir.
It's dead in short run, hopefully. And before I begin to answer this, I'll put 2 caveats here. Firstly, the traditional definition, as I'll explain, of economic nationalism does not apply to India. And secondly, India does not have a right when it comes to economy. So if the cultural right is the traditional left.
Right.
There is no economic right thinking group or platform in India till date. Nobody believes in free market. Very few people do, and all they do is scoff at when policies like demonetization or policies like waiver of loans, when these things come, we can just only scoff at that. We can be angry at them, but there is nothing. We have no opinion, we have no standing, and nobody listens to us, very honestly. Neither the left listens to us, nor the cultural right listens to us. So we are a very minority. Before I begin explaining what exactly is economic nationalism. Now, why has this concept recently gained a lot of importance is because how US has started behaving under President Trump. They started renegotiating their treaties. They renegotiated NAFTA. They decided to nix certain treaties. They decided to leave WTO court. He has threatened to leave WHO. He renegotiated his NATO agreement. He single-handedly decided to shift from multilateralism to bilateralism, where he will negotiate his interest with every country one-on-one rather than having a set framework. Now, economic nationalism itself means, actually, in the traditional definition, it has 4 aspects to it. Firstly, it hates immigration. They want to curb immigration as much as they can. They want foreign money without any strings attached, or basically no foreign money. They would be happy if they don't have foreign money. And if they are getting it, they would rather have it in consumer sectors rather than critical sectors. Thirdly, they would have protectionist trade policies, protecting which are the resources which are inside. And fourthly, discarding multilateralism. Economic nationalism hates multilateralism. As simple as that. They do not want to be part of organizations where there is a law of averages applied. They want customization. They want there is a term for it. They want let's go with free market only. They want a free market, but which is free only for their domestic companies or for the manufacturing that is happening within their domestic areas, because there has to be something substantially beneficial for them. Not in the terms of trade, but in the terms of production in the country. It requires nationalization of 3 things: production, distribution, and policy making. The focus is to nationalize and domesticate these 3 aspects of the entire policy framework or the governance model.
Right.
Now, you want to control the natural resources and you want to undermine the international organizations. As simple as that. Now let's take example of countries, how this entire thing has come into fore and why I say that free market is almost dead. Brexit, firstly.
Right.
The entire concept of European Union is now being questioned. A lot of countries are now questioning. After UK, we can also expect a couple of more countries to get out of EU in next 2 to 3 years. Britain itself will see a lot of referendums and things happening in long term, where its colonies will get out. I will still refer to them colonies rather than its states. Then you can see Brazil terminated a lot of investment arbitration treaties. Brazil is getting out. A rise of, and you will notice that surprisingly the rise of this economic nationalism is also, not surprisingly actually, it's very logical, is coincidental with rise of populist movements.
Right.
In India also, in Brazil, you can see they have a president who does not know what to speak, when to speak, what to do, when to do. You can see US also, and I can repeat the same sentences. But it's
maybe not in
like,
India. Maybe not in India. India has a very.
I would say in India, I have a free speech, absolute. Yeah, I don't care. Also, the only point is, I don't think that our bureaucracy is so strong, so weak that it will allow anyone to do whatever they want. We still have a structured course. I will not say we have reached to the level of US or Brazil, especially Brazil. Brazil is just gone to the rocks. So Brazil is a different. Argentina took a lot of calls in nationalizing its resources, in invoking BIT. US has left WTO court. It has threatened WHO. It has decided to withdraw from a couple of UN agencies. It has stopped funding to, I think, 17 UN agencies. It reduced its funding to NATO. US aid funding has decreased. FMS has decreased. So it's also rethinking its entire multilateralism, which it used to champion. American liberalism was something that the world looked up to when any crisis came, anything came. Now it's receding itself. It wants to protect everything in its border. And India, of course. Surprisingly, India started this economic nationalism not under the present government. It started with 2012 Chidambaram. When Chidambaram announced that India will rethink all its bilateral investment treaties, it will rethink its bilateral trade agreements, because it thought, it assumed, or it not assumed, it actually felt, and it was legitimate, that we were being shortchanged, we were being um, we were being unfairly treated in this entire investment arbitration regime. It happened. Then we decided to renegotiate our agreements, trade agreements. We refused to sign the RCEP, which was a multilateral forum. We are also rethinking of our WTO association. Our focus on negotiating trade agreements is based on very peculiar things based on our regions rather than a law of averages. So we are also moving towards that. It's in line with almost all the countries. Germany also, for instance, decided to screen the Chinese companies, Chinese investments which are flowing in. US today, in fact, has yesterday only has decided to impose certain more sanctions on China regarding the chip manufacturing, which will completely um, demolish Chinese 5G companies. It's an end for them. Right. So everybody will start moving in rather than expanding out.
Right, sir. So you mentioned you mentioned how this entire situation of economic nationalism is affecting investment arbitration, and that is my next question. As in, how is it affecting investment arbitration as a niche area? Is it creating problems for investment arbitration, or is it changing the contours under which we see investment arbitration growing or functioning in the world?
See, in one line, we are going to see a shift from multilateral investment treaties to bilateral investment treaties, and from bilateral investment treaties to national investment codes. So the concept of investment arbitration is that a normal private party can bring a claim against an international entity, for instance, an international state, a sovereign state, that itself looks quite unbalanced when you think of it, but this is what it allows you to, and it's a very good creation of international law. There is no doubt about it, but it has ended up hampering a lot of developing countries who want to take care of their resources slightly more rigidly than the developed states. They are marred by corruption, they are marred by nepotism. Most of them have dictators. They have just come out of dictatorship, where they realized that the erstwhile dictator or erstwhile government had sold their entire natural resources to companies which had bribed these dictators, or who had resettled these dictators or governments outside the country. So they want to renegotiate these contracts, they want to renegotiate their policies, and they found it difficult. For instance, Ecuador is the worst country when it comes to oil and energy contracts. It has been sued multiple of times. Mexico paid for this. A lot of developing countries, in fact, India suffered its losses through White Industries. Then again in Devas we lost. There were some 17 investment arbitration claims pending against us as of December 2019. I'm not sure of what is the situation now. Russia was planning to sue India for demonetization for the issues it suffered. So a lot of Russian companies, not Russia. So a lot of these issues have arisen. So it will give rise to a lot of disputes. Because we will move towards economic nationalism. We want to protect our resources much more than we used to do earlier. We want to treat our domestic companies at a step above the way we treat the foreign companies. That is also back of our mind. There it is. We don't say it very openly because it will hamper investment, but that is what if you do a study of the regulations that are coming out, there is of course a bias towards, there has to be a bias, and there is a bias towards the domestic companies or the companies which have origin in India, not only manufacture in India. Now, let's take an example. For instance, India in 2015 came out with a model bilateral investment treaty. Now that, if you see the model text, and I'll send you a link, you can put it in your podcast again. It looks more like a national investment code rather than a treaty. No sane country in the world which is with which we have a trade deficit. For instance, US, China, Germany, UK, they will not execute that treaty with us because they want their investments to be protected in the country, and that model treaty does not offer anything. It is a merely restatement of our sovereignty. It's an absurd document, but it actually signifies that what we are planning to do. We don't want these treaties anymore. We want to treat every case on a case-to-case basis. We want the foreign companies to submit to the national jurisdiction, national law of our country to the maximum extent possible. And as I said, only one country till date has signed that model BIT with India, that is Cambodia. And we export to Cambodia. Cambodia doesn't export to us. So Cambodia is very happy to have our investments not protected in Cambodia. We would be at in fact, by signing that treaty, we are at a loss, and I don't know why this government signed that treaty, or why does a bureaucrat or the government came out with that model BIT, to be honest.
Nice.
But it will affect, the disputes will increase, the fight between the companies which have, especially in the energy and coal sector, the fights and disputes will increase, and the focus on economic nationalism will change the way we look at investment arbitration. The focus on sovereignty will increase, and more countries will denounce the investment arbitration system.
Right, sir. So that brings me to a very interesting point that you've mentioned. We understand how India is placed in this entire situation and how India is going through various changes as well, and what recently has happened in India. But with COVID-19 as a new development that we see here, and the kind of pandemic that is creating a situation across the world, how is COVID-19 going to affect the situation? Is it going to worsen the problem, or is it going to give us new opportunities?
Atmanirbhar Bharat. That is an example of what
I kind of saw that coming.
It will hasten in the process. COVID-19 will force the world to rethink its supply chains. A lot of countries will move away from China. A lot of countries will try to get out of a single supplier situation. What happened with us specifically in pharmaceutical ingredient sector, the API which are required to manufacture medicines, a lot of our APIs were coming from China. And until the government stepped in and got those APIs by negotiating with China, or forcing itself to buy a lot of their stuff, medical supplies, and giving them concession, we were not getting those APIs, and it would have been a quite different scenario. This has forced India at least to rethink in its manufacturing capabilities, to relocate its critical equipment, for instance, heavy industries, solar equipments, electronics, and pharmaceuticals, as well as certain textile dyes which are required in manufacturing of medical products. Specifically, then again, Japan has also decided to incentivize its company who are moving away from China, double incentivize companies who are moving back to Japan. So Japan is one of the biggest foreign money spenders. In fact, it's one of the biggest spenders in India and all these countries abroad, where you used to finance rather than sending its people on the ground. That's what China does. China used to send its companies on the ground to execute a project. We will talk about OBOR in a couple of minutes in COVID only. But China used to send its companies. Japan used to send money. Now Japan is ready to pay money to its own companies to relocate their productions back to Japan. So COVID is going to hasten the process. COVID is going to change the way we look at sovereignty, we look at manufacturing, we look at supply chains. India is well placed, and Atmanirbhar Bharat, it sounds very nice when to see, unless the economic left and cultural right screw it up to make it into a Swadeshi movement, that only Patanjali products or only products which are made in India will be not made in India, made by Indian companies will be appreciated. If that screw up doesn't happen, we are going to do good. The only problem I see is that economic left and cultural right joining hands on this and making a mess out of this. And the free market guys and the guys who are hoping that foreign companies will come and the foreign market and our markets will open, we will see diversification of imports, diversification of manufacturing, will face a loss. So let's see how ready we are and how mature we are. Right. On the second aspect, on investment arbitration, I see a lot of claims increasing because COVID will force a lot of countries which were part of OBOR, One Belt, One Road initiative of China, to default. And considering the China's aggressive position right now on everything, I see them also taking a lot of interest in investment arbitration. OBOR provides for China International Trade Corporation and China International and Economic Trade Arbitration Commission. For as the nodal arbitration agency, it has a Hong Kong branch also, which is also the nodal agency. So I see a lot of investment arbitration going there, especially with African companies and African countries, and a lot of Chinese companies. Very interestingly, and this is unheard of, most of the OBOR clauses provide for expropriation of African countries' resources by Chinese companies if African countries fail to repay the loan. So generally it's the otherwise, that I nationalize your resources and I pay for you. So if a foreign company is in India, if I nationalize its resources, if I nationalize its company, I pay the compensation. In this case, if the host country, for instance, India, is unable to repay Chinese loan, China will have the ability to nationalize, to expropriate my resources in my country, which were kept as collateral. So all the bridges, for instance, it has made in Nigeria, they will become Chinese resources, and China will collect a toll for 100 years from Nigerian citizens.
Right.
Because Nigeria failed to pay the loan. So these are very interesting clauses which we'll see being used in investment arbitration.
So this in expropriation in particular, does this mean that will this change the way we see at legitimate, illegitimate expropriation, and how public policy attaches itself to the concept, and how Chinese government is sort of promoting a neo-colonial form of an economic activity in these countries?
Yeah,
I wouldn't go there,
colonialism.
but yes.
See, it is colonialism. Yeah, of course it is. There is no doubt about it. But OBOR, India was, I think, the only country. India and Taiwan were the only two countries who saw this from the beginning, and I would credit the government for this, and I'll credit our foreign ministers, both Sushma Swaraj and the current foreign minister, for this, because they actually saw through this. I don't think the others might have that maturity on international security to do this, but they actually saw, and on this aspect, our government has done phenomenally well when it comes to foreign policy. I think leave the Pakistan policy or our Nepal policy for a bit. On an OBOR and calling China out, we have done exceptionally well. We are doing exceptionally well as of now. And the aggression we see in China as of now, I think it's mostly because of its immature bureaucracy. And diplomacy. They have not dealt with countries. Its bureaucrats are not trained outside. They don't have experience outside where they actually talk. Most of the conversation used to happen through the businesses which were controlled by China. Most of the interaction, if you read the US policy books, most of the interactions between US policymakers and China were through Chinese businessmen who were controlled by who were CCP party members. Now suddenly these bureaucrats are on forefront because Chinese companies are feeling the heat. No policymaker wants to see himself being even talking to Chinese businesses as of now. So these bureaucrats are on the forefront, and they are unable to withstand the pressure, and they think that bulldozing their way out in almost every country and every situation will get them through. Might be difficult, might work. Nobody knows what future holds for us. But yes, we will see a lot of new things coming up because of this Chinese aggressive diplomacy, as well as the peculiar clauses in the OBOR contracts, as well as the COVID-induced defaults, which are a certainty.
Right, sir. Well, sir, if I completely understand, obviously, I will most certainly watch this entire video again to completely understand each and every aspect, make notes and study them, but very properly. But there are very few points that I have taken up, and they have been very key to my understanding of how this entire issue of investment arbitration is being affected by not just economic nationalism, and how this entire situation is being again affected by COVID-19 as a pandemic, and this is creating new circumstances. So I believe if we were to conclude all of this as a form of a closing remark for this segment for all my listeners, would you have some opinion on that?
Also, one more before I sum it up, there's one more thing.
Yes, sir. Please. Yes, sir.
Force majeure and frustration will also see a lot of interpretation in international investment arbitration. These clauses will also be invoked a lot in these contracts, and a lot of tribunals will now interpret. A lot of supply chain contracts will fail. So right, both the segments we discussed today are interrelated, and we will see a lot of discussion on that aspect also.
Right, sir.
The sum up would be that we are in an unprecedented situation. The entire focus right now of each and every commercial contract or policy maneuvering or policy making right now, as in the entire world, depends on one single thing, that is doctrine of good faith. These are unprecedented times. These are not the times for politics or economic machoism or trying to make illegitimate commercial benefits out of it or force businesses into a situation where they cannot operate. This is a time for everybody to act in good faith and expect that situation will get better, because times of economic hardship are coming, and to club them with political maneuverism like rise of economic nationalism without thought through consequences, and for in specific to India, if we mix up the Swadeshi with Indian origin companies, that will ultimately do harm. We have to go ahead with free market in India. Little bit regulation is required because we are indisciplined people, but at the end I think we'll have to focus more on free market. Economic nationalism might be a temporary phenomena. I don't see it going ahead in long term. Free market in short run is dead, there is no doubt, but I hope that it will come back soon.
Right, sir. Well, thank you so much, sir. I believe I've had a very constructive conversation today. This has been a very in-depth analysis of two very relevant, contemporary, and burning topics that we see everywhere around us, affecting multiple areas of legal field. Thank you so much for taking time out for this podcast today. We've talked about how and why force majeure clause and why the frustration clause are two different concepts, need to be understood in different ways, need to be interpreted in different ways. We've also understood how economic nationalism is going to affect the concepts of investment arbitration, or we talk about how it's going to affect investment in general. We talked about how COVID-19 is going to affect all of this situation, and how both the force majeure clauses and the concept behind the same and the investment clause here are two very connected issues. So thank you so much, sir, for taking time out for this discussion today. I had a wonderful time. I hope you had a good time too.
Same here, Kaustubh. Thank you for having me once again.
Thank you so much, sir. This was a wonderful opportunity. Thank you, sir.
Bye, take care.